Okay, so the recording started. The ethics of ambiguity. So initial impressions, anybody have any first thoughts? Quentin was saying before we got things going that he liked it, but it was cryptic. How about you guys?
I was wondering if you had different translations of the word ambiguity.
No, I don't.
French. Seems like it might not exactly grasp what she's going for.
Yeah, I can't, I don't know what the French word is, so I don't know how accurate it is. I'd imagine pretty accurate, but I'm not a translator or a French speaker. We could actually look it up. Why don't we see? If still open. Por un moral de la ambiguité. Yeah, it's definitely ambiguity, or at least it's a cognate. Pardon my awful French pronunciation. Here, I'll put it in the chat.
It's at the beginning of the book too.
Oh, is it? Could have just looked there. There you go. Yeah, so that seems pretty clearly to me to be ambiguity. But we'll talk a lot about today what ambiguity consists in. Any other initial impressions before we run into it? Dallas got very lost. Yeah, I get lost too. Yeah, she was writing a diss on her partner's work. Several of her partners' work. She had many partners. Not just in the old cowboy kind of way, you know, maybe actually in the old cowboy kind of way. All right, so we'll just get into it first. Administrative, we have 1 week left after this week. Next week, I will post your final. I will plan on having it done with the exception of the final question, which will have to do with next week's lecture. So I'll post that after lecture that night after I write that question. I'm going to stick around and make that happen. At least that's what I'm planning, bar any peculiar circumstances. Your final exam, it's optional. Again, optional 50 points, up to 50 points to earn, will be posted next week, and it'll be open until, I don't know, August 11th, I think is the date that I set for everything else, right? Is that what I said in the email? Yeah, so August 11th is our date where all of the grades have to be submitted. So you have until that day to shore up your grades. This goes for everybody in the Zoom call and everybody outside. Yeah, so up until, like the final, if you send me emails at like midnight, the night before your final is due, or like of your final being due, it's very unlikely that I will have the time or wherewithal to get to it. I'm a busy guy. I do all sorts of stuff. So you need to treat your questions about the final, which I will answer. If you have any content-based questions, you can ask me anything. You can ask me almost literally exactly what one of the questions in a prompt is on the exam itself, and I will answer it for you. But you got to give me time to do that. So, I got several questions super last minute on the midterm that I was busy. I just like couldn't get to. So do yourself a favor and do me a favor by preempting those questions, but I will answer them, yes. So if you have any worries about content or confusions or whatever, send me an email. I'll explain it back, and then that should help you with the final. Because again, that's part of the process of learning, right? Is asking questions, finding answers, developing understanding, all of that. It would be in bad faith for me not to answer your content-based philosophical questions. Okay, so get your grades in order. You have just a couple of weeks till August 11th, but after next week, you won't have the weekly reminder of this class to keep you going. You will have a couple of my reminders. I suppose I'll send emails as we get really close and I see that people are threatening failure. I don't like that. So I'll help you by, like flashing big red warning lights, like, beware, beware. You're gonna fail if you don't do something about it. Okay, so get your grades in order. One way to do this is respond to your classmates' discussion posts. You can respond to one a week as long as it's a good response. You can earn up to like 50 points doing this. It's a pretty substantial, hefty portion of the grade and an easy way to earn it. Plus, it opens up the potential for your classmates to earn more points on the back of your responses. So everybody wins. Write your papers. If you're writing papers, get that done, and then prepare for the final. Reach out to me if you need help. Like I was saying, I will be accommodating. It's my job to see you all succeed, and I take that seriously. But I can only help you if you help me help you. So help me by helping yourself and helping me help you. Is that clear? Yeah, good. Perfectly cromulent. More and less like the Ethics of Ambiguity. Okay. Simone de Beauvoir. Oh, I should, before we dive in, any administrative questions? So I answered one. Scott gives a thumbs up, or I suppose it's this direction. I don't know if it's the right direction when the camera does it, but it's one of these. It's not both at the same time. Any other administrative questions before we move forward? Oh, I have two more administrative points. One is if you're planning to go to graduate school and you are in the Zoom call, hang out after the call. We'll talk for like 2 minutes really quickly. In graduate school in philosophy, I should be specific. I can't help you if you're trying to go to med school. But graduate school in philosophy is something I know quite a lot about. And we'll just chat for a brief 2 minutes to see if there's interest in a workshop. And second, everybody please stick around after the Zoom call ends. I'm gonna stop recording and then share a brief message real quick. Okay, so getting into it, Simone de Beauvoir here, like there's like her Grace Kelly-esque headshot and a couple of other awesome pictures of her. And you can already tell how long the slide is going to be by how small the text is and how like cropped up to the top it is. There's a lot to say about Simone de Beauvoir, the person, right? So her family lost most of their wealth during World War I. She did not lose her father, however, unlike every other thinker pretty much that we've studied over this summer session, which I didn't even realize before it was putting together these lectures. Kind of an interesting fun fact. But Simone de Beauvoir had a very supportive father. Her father enjoyed her precociousness and her intellectual nature, her stick it to you, powerful woman, girl, I suppose, growing up in a man's world. Her dad was very supportive of her. She was also brilliant. She found herself the brightest young minds, the young, bright men in Paris, connected herself to them because she had to make her own way in the world. That she didn't have a dowry. She didn't have any prospects to like marry into wealth. She would have to do it all herself. And in a world that was crippled by the First World War and the entire loss of a generation, it's a little tough in something like an economic downturn of that sort. To make your own way. And so what she does, using her brilliant mind, finds the other most brilliant young minds, Merleau-Ponty, Sartre. I don't think Derrida was on the scene quite yet. He was later, but Merleau-Ponty was like her first intellectual contact, and gets connected with them and uses them to sneak into university classes where she can sit in. She can't afford to pay for them herself, and she would be let in anyways. But she sits in when she can by sneaking into the university classes, and then takes the like university, how well did you learn test. So the way that European college classes work is there's no assignments. There's just one big test at the end of the semester. You go to lecture, you don't, and then you take the test. And if you pass, great. And if you don't, then you're out, right? And she ties Sartre after having not actually formally taken the classes and just sneaking in when she can. And it was Sartre's second time, and she aces it, right? Does just as well as the highest score. She grew up Catholic, but became and remained an atheist after her adolescence from her teen years. She was a bisexual intellectual hero. So not only was she, like Sartre, an intellectual celebrity, she was also something of like a sexual celebrity too. And I don't mean in like what was her name? Madame Godiva, right? Yeah, in a Madame Godiva way, but she was very open about the openness of her sexual nature. And in fact, that was a large part of her intellectual life too. And so her celebrity was one of intellectually sexual curiosity, as well as like just deeply intellectual curiosity as well. Her partner in both romance and career for her whole life long was Jean-Paul Sartre, though they never married. They were sort of always together. They would, so the rumor goes, they would seduce each other's students for one another, which is these days very inappropriate. But you know, that was what they did. She was also a feminist hero. Like the most famous quote from The Second Sex is, "One is not born, but becomes a woman," which is now taken, and it's probably pretty apocryphal to say this, but like that she meant it this way at least. But it is now said that this statement was the first expression of the gender sex distinction in like intellectual history. So in Her Second Sex, she is beginning to like literally beginning to carve up the intellectual space that becomes you know, the feminist and critical race theory and deconstructive ethics and all of this. Like she is like a founder of this kind of thinking, in saying one is not born but becomes a woman. And the idea of the second sex, the main argument is that men and women are not equal but different. And that's not to say that they shouldn't be equal, right? There should be some sort of baseline equality, she argues, but to say that men and women are at base equal, and this made her like, she made a lot of other feminists at the time really angry and unhappy with her because she had these opinions and arguments that like men and women aren't actually equal. Her argument is that men and women are structurally different, right? The gender sex distinction, they're real things and they are separate. And to say that men and women are at base equal is to say that, as she argues, women ought to be treated like men, which is a kind of gender discrimination, so she argues. And it's with this argument that she sets off the force that begins the second wave of feminism. So this force is the idea that, again, women are equal in society, causes gender discrimination. And also in the second sex, she's developing an existentialist take on the problem of being, and not just being period, but being a woman, right? Which has to do with the othering of women by men, right? Where men are disclosed to women and women to men by this like othering, disclosing interaction. But what men do to women is they other them in a way that it other them, right, as a verb, turn them into objects of ideals, into essences, these almost non-existing on a pedestal kind of objects. And this causes all sorts of bad faith, right? That men are being disclosed by essence proceeding, that by like for itself, or sorry, in itself objects. They're being disclosed about themselves in the wrong sort of way. And women are treated not as the right sorts of beings with dignity. They may be treated as humans, but not humans with dignity. So also interesting note, Beauvoir hesitated calling herself a feminist for a really long time, till like the 1970s, I want to say. Because the feminism in Europe of her time was often super violent and not terribly philosophically principled. And that's not to say that it's a dig at, you know, like the first wave European feminism, but revolutionary attitudes, of course, were required to make revolutionary strides. But what feminism was missing was what de Beauvoir gave to it, which set her apart from the feminists of the day, and going in both directions, right? They didn't like her and she wasn't much a fan of what they had to say. There's a lot of really vitriolic feminist arguments that we won't get into. It's not that kind of class, but it's a really interesting intellectual period and history at this time. So if you have the opportunity to take a class on this kind of material, it's a lot of like really fascinating stuff, philosophically and politically. Yeah, Sarah, you have a hand.
Could you just highlight briefly, like what the main division point was between her and the first wave? Was it that she was saying women are biologically different, but gender is created? And the first wave was saying we want it all equal, kind of? Or could you just highlight that a little?
So again, the gender sex distinction, this is like where it's sourced, but to say that it's sourced there, in my estimation, is apocryphal. So de Beauvoir is credited in saying one is not born but becomes a woman, right? With drawing this distinction between sex female and gender female. But that she meant it that way in the way that we use this distinction today, almost certainly apocryphal. So like just some carefulness with that kind of like connection drawing. But this is the main distinction right here. So good questions. It was the next slide. The first push of feminism was to say, look, like, hey, we exist and we're humans too. We matter, right? And you can't treat us like chattel. You got to treat us like people. We should be allowed to own things and vote for things, sort of full stop, right? And the next move is to say, okay, we're not just humans, but we're like existing things. We are beings who have dignity and freedom, expressive of meaning and disclosing being in the world and disclosing further freedom in the world. This is part of the existentialist project. And so to take that next step from look, women are people too, to women are people deserving of the sort of dignity that they deserve, is, you know, a next move forward. And this is like the second wave development, right? So as an existentialist, she felt a conversion during the post-war period and war period itself. That's a typo. She could no longer focus on herself. She speaks about this. She says, look, at like the war changed me. It changed the way that I want to use my mind to work in the world. I can't just focus on myself, my own pleasure and my own happiness anymore. I've seen the lowest lows that humanity can get to. And, you know, I have the ability and power to do something about it. So I'm going to. And so she becomes a big time girl boss and devotes herself to the social need, the good of the people, right? The disestablishment of fascist rule throughout the world, the enfranchisement of the impoverished and the weak, the you know, giving of dignity to people who deserve it, but were not afforded it for reasons of bad faith, which we'll see that the groundwork set today, though not completely developed until we finish the reading next week. Okay. So her existentialism and Sartre's are very parallel, right? She's going to take some digs at Sartre, but mostly like they're living as career partners, right? So they think similarly. They're both deeply inspired by this kind of activism, right? This sort of activism that gets rid of fascism, that helps the people, right? That sees peace and democracy. Right? So living was not a solitary project for de Beauvoir and for Sartre, as we learned in Existentialism is Humanism, right? This co-disclosure, this othering. And the deep problems of being require co-resolution, that it's not enough to be okay yourself. You have to be okay yourself with others, because one is not oneself without others. So they will argue. And thus we get a kind of Marxist political bent, which we will talk about. She takes aim in it once in this section and once next week, objecting to the Marxist ideas, though she herself appropriates a lot of the ethos of the Marxist project. And we'll talk about a little bit about that today for those of you interested in Marxist ideas and these like politically philosophically political concepts. I'll say it right now, I'm not a master of political philosophy. I've read a little bit, but it's not like my main area of focus. So I'm interested to hear from you guys what your expertise says about some of her arguments that will be coming up. Okay, so what we get from today's first read of the Ethics of Ambiguity, the first little bit less than a half, is all set up in preamble, right? It's all of like the methodology and metaphysics that needs to be set up in order to give us the ethics of ambiguity, okay? So she discusses metaphysical and epistemic underpinnings for being. She discusses possible and imperfect responses to these underpinnings, like ways that we can go wrong in getting set up to be an existentially ethical person, one of which is an objection to Camus' existentialist absurdism. And finally, she sets the conceptual groundwork for the importance of freedom as a tool to work within ambiguity and act positively in the social world that is to be ethically free. So these are all like the jargony concepts that we'll break down. This reading is hard and will continue to be hard. But hopefully, as we dig into these concepts and give them a little more light than she does in the book, it'll all sort of start to fall together. Okay, so what is ambiguity? We've heard a lot of talk about absurdity or abandonment, the death of God, etc. For de Beauvoir, the condition of being a human is one of ambiguity. Now, she mentions the absurd here and there, I think more as a metaphor. We should, at least this is the way I think about it. I think of Camus' The Absurd and Sartre's Anguish and Abandonment as de Beauvoir's ambiguity, which is an interesting term to use. The absurd is there, right? But what matters is something more epistemic. It's something to do more with how we think about the world, how consciousness collects the world, rather than like with what the world is, right? So the absurd is that there was like the fact of the absurd and the feeling of the absurd. The fact of the absurd is like an ontological statement that the world is meaningless and we need meaning. And so humankind and world, the thing that needs meaning, the thing that can't get it, clash together, and there's the absurd. For de Beauvoir, the issue is less ontological, less about the constituents of world and humankind in relation with one another, and more about how the human mind appropriates and becomes conscious and aware of the world around her. And this is why it becomes a matter of ambiguity rather than of absurdity. And the difference, again, in terminology is an important one, because ambiguity is something that can be clarified. Maybe it can never become completely clear, but something that's ambiguous can be made clearer, right? Whereas the absurd, and especially as we hear it through someone like the mouthpiece of Ivan or Albert Camus, the absurd is impenetrable. It's completely opaque. There's no breaking through it. So ambiguity is a very deliberately chosen concept here to capture the analogous quality of being that the absurd does, though it makes it epistemic and thus makes it resolvable, which is the whole point, right? The whole point of this book is to take on the problem of being that we've been talking about for the entire summer session and make it possible to be optimistically ethical within such a condition. So the absurd being metaphysical, ontological, there's nothing we can do about it. It's opaque. It's an unhelpful concept, and it inspires anguish and despair. So she recommends, hey, she doesn't like explicitly recommend this, but that's why she uses the word ambiguity. Says, hey, let's like forget about it. Forget about the absurd and consider another way through this problematic mire of being, one that affords an optimistic ethics, an ethics that allows us to live well together. So what is ambiguity? How is it constructed? Where does it work? Well, we get this distinction of concepts that she uses without explaining from being and nothingness, which is Sartre's really giant tome, which is a distinction between the in itself and the for itself. And we should recall from last week the arguments Sartre gives about existence preceding essence. We have objects like a paper knife for whom essence precedes existence. These are objects that have an existence in itself, right? Because the essence is the precedent for the object. And so it is like in itself, the form of the thing is there. And then there are objects that are for themselves, which are beings for whom existence precedes essence, conscious humankind, right? And these are to be distinguished. Now, humankind has a dual nature. Humankind has a nature that is both in itself and for itself. And so I made this meme. This is another one. This is a Spencer Ivy original. So the in itself, again, are like material objects for whom essence precedes existence, the paper knife, and objects that are for itself are immanent beings for whom existence precedes essence. And for us, for humankind, there's a clash between our nothingness, the nothingness inspired by the for itself nature, that void into which we peer when we consider the fact of our radical responsibility, that there is no essence. When we dig deep down, we find nothing. Right? There's this incredible negativity, which is not to say a negativity emotively, but just like a lack of what we're looking for, negativity, right? This is the emptiness that we find that inspires the feeling of abandonment, says Sartre. And so for us immanent beings, humankind, for whom existence precedes essence, we recognize ourselves both as needing to project some sort of essence, but not having it initially present. But there's also a facticity of what we are, right? This is a Heideggerian word, facticity. The facticity thing would be like your essential, like for the sake of nature. So our bodies are for the sake of eating food and moving around and having families, making babies, procreating, whatever it is, right? That our bodies have biological functions. The body is sort of, in a sense, like a paper knife, or at least it has a representable function or sets of representable functions that are efficacious in the world. They do things. And so here I have a picture of, the dude like pointing at himself in the mirror very aggressively. I'm never that angry at myself when and I think he's touching the mirror too. Don't touch your mirror. Don't do that. It gets smudgy. You can't see your for itself. So the clash is, say you're looking in the mirror and you see your body and you think that's me, but then you're thinking that's me, and then you identify with the thinking thing that is saying that's me. And all of a sudden there's this space. There's this space between the object that you recognize as yourself and the thinking thing that projects that judgment onto the object that is thinking, right? And here is the clash between the nothingness of our for itself nature and the facticity of the in itself nature that are both sort of swirling around in the being of humankind. And it's this juxtaposition, this clash, this battle that Sartre says inspires the inspiration to will, freedom, etc. And same for de Beauvoir. So the mind-body problem just got existential, right? It's not about like where are the boundaries of mind and body, but like when you have this clash of mind and body, it doesn't matter like if there is a distinction between mind and body or where the distinction is. What matters is the clash, right? Is this experience as of this being, as of clashing between the nothingness and facticity of our dual nature. So the body is a determining physical force that says, I will be here, I will be there, I will do this, I will do that. But the nature of being is open to the free actualization of future possibility. It doesn't just rely on the present, it projects itself out into the future where the body does not yet exist. And again, we have more of this gap between self and self, which in, again, Heideggerian language, this inspires his form of anxiety, which is recognizing of the deep space of nothingness that lives in between those two dual features of humankind. His view of anxiety is awesome. It's kind of tough, both to read because he's very confusing and emotionally. Okay, so as she says, big long quote. From the very beginning, existentialism defined itself as a philosophy of ambiguity. It was by affirming the irreducible character of ambiguity that Kierkegaard opposed himself to Hegel in Fear and Trembling. And it is by ambiguity that in our generation, Sartre and Being and Nothingness fundamentally define man, that being whose being is not to be, that subjectivity which realizes itself only as a presence in the world, that engaged freedom, that surging of the for oneself, which is immediately given to others. But it is also claimed that existentialism is a philosophy of the absurd and of despair. It encloses man in a sterile anguish, in an empty subjectivity. It is incapable of furnishing him with any principle for making choices. Let him do as he pleases. In any case, the game is lost. Does not Sartre declare that a man is a useless passion, that he tries in vain to realize the synthesis of the for oneself and the in oneself to make himself God? It is true. But it is also true that the most optimistic ethics have all begun by emphasizing the element of failure involved in the condition of man, which is the failure to unify the for oneself and the in oneself together in our own being to make ourselves a kind of God. And we can't project that out into some like abstract God, so argues the existentialist, because we don't have the quality of being, that sort of thing. So, emphasizing the element of failure involved in the condition of man, because without failure, no ethics for a being who from the very start would be an exact coincidence with himself, a perfect plenitude. The notion of having two would have no meaning, right? So in this failure, we get an inspiration to do a kind of ethics, which is inspiring her to engage in the ethics of ambiguity. So the failure, that is ambiguity, to unify the for oneself and the in oneself, these two qualities of humankind, of being, right, is not a subjective and solipsistic endpoint for existentialist thought, so she says, right? It's not just a matter of absurdity and despair and how do we deal with that, right? Do we kill ourselves? But no, that's the wrong question, she says. Rather, it is a beginning. It is an ambiguous beginning from which an ethics might be developed to help clarify, right? We don't have to kill ourselves. Don't worry about that, right? All we have to do is figure out enough of a way forward to clear the ambiguity before us, to begin to unify, if not in ourselves, then at least with each other, so that we can work towards unifying ourselves. Okay. So the beginnings of an ethics. Like other existentialists, de Beauvoir believes that in the precedence of existence over essence for conscious beings, there could be no absolute outside morality. We get all of the core premises of existentialism or existentialist thought, generally broadly construed, that we got in Camus, that we got in Sartre, that we see beginning in Kierkegaard, Dostoevsky, and Nietzsche, right? That existence precedes essence, that there's no external absolute morality declaring what human existence consists in, what it ought to consist in. We decide that for ourselves, because again, everything is permissible, but not in the vulgar way, or really not at all, says Beauvoir. But the idea that the sentiment is there, that we are absolutely free, and we have to deal with that freedom in the face of absurdity, ambiguity, whatever we want to call it, right? So the first implication of this existentialist attitude is that the genuine man will not agree to recognize any foreign absolute. There is no God, there is no virtue ethics, there's nothing out there. There is just ambiguity, void, anxiety, emptiness, abandonment, despair. When a man projects into an ideal heaven that impossible synthesis of the for itself and the in itself that is called God, it is because he wishes the regard of this existing being to change his existence into being. But if he agrees not to be in order to exist genuinely, he will abandon the dream of inhuman objectivity. He will understand that it is not a matter of being right in the eyes of God, but of being right in his own eyes. And this is what it is to be radically free, right? Is to not offshore your responsibility to some conceptual impossibility of God in itself unified with a for itself, and say, oh, well, you know, I did it because God made me do it, or because God gave me the free will to do it, or whatever. No, in the absence of this kind of unity, of this kind of absolute, of this essence, all that's left is us, right? in the space of ambiguous emptiness, for the sake of resolving that despair, all we can do is become responsible to ourselves. And so it's not a matter of being right in the eyes of God or whatever other moral system that is supposed to be ultimate, abject, categorical, whatever, but rather of being able to justify our own existences to ourselves. And it's important to note that this is a point where Camus stops. Camus interested in, okay, like, how do I justify being for myself, right? But Sartre and de Beauvoir are going to take one extra step. They're going to say, how do I justify existence for being with others too? And I should make one other caveat note that that is true for the Camus up to what we've read in this class. There is like an ethical, universalized side to Camus, but we just haven't covered it, right? So for future class. So if what we're trying to do is justify being in our own eyes, but to justify being is to justify together, then we get a kind of Marxism. But do we actually, do we really see Marxist thought in de Beauvoir? So she says, it is known that the essential point on which existentialist ontology is opposed is dialectical materialism. And I'll define dialectical materialism in a moment, I think. Do I? Yeah, I do. Okay, so we think that the meaning of a situation does not impose itself on the consciousness of a passive subject. That is, it surges up only by the disclosure which a free subject effects in its project. It appears evident to us that in order to adhere to Marxism, to enroll in a party and in one another, or in one party rather than another, is to be actively attached to it. And even a Marxist needs a decision whose source is only in himself, which is to say that, like, look, if we're trying to decide how to justify our being, we can pick some absolute form that's out there, which is what the dialectical materialist view would say. Again, to be defined. It's just another like idea that would fill the role of God. Even the Marxist needs to decide for themselves, otherwise they're acting wantonly, right? They're just being sort of forced along like a ball rolling down a hill. To the Marxist, a man's actions seem valid only if the man is not helped set it going by an internal movement. To admit the ontological possibility of a choice is already to betray the cause. If you think for yourself too much, you've betrayed the cause. It's because if you're going to be truly communist, truly a Marxist, truly like one of the proletariat, then you are spurred forward by the party, right? Not by yourself. You're not an individual. You're not trying to make yourself stand out and from the rest that require you to toe the line and do what the party needs you to do. And so we see this initial bit of texture raised between the political side to Marxism and the philosophical underpinnings of existentialist thought, which requires that we be free. So this isn't to say that she wasn't interested in Marxism. No, she's just pointing out a problem with engaging in the methodology in the wrong sort of way. So what she's going to do is she's going to appropriate the ideas and concepts of the Marxist project, and even like the praxis too, the like how to do it, without giving away the existentialist premises, the radical freedom, the need to be free, the fact that freedom is the only key to unlock clarity in the absurd or the ambiguous. And de Beauvoir was an activist in all sorts of French liberal communist protests. But since she's taking aim at some of the Marxist principles here, pointing out the failure of dialectical materialism to afford the appropriate attitude towards being. So dialectical materialism is, it says that political and historical events rise from a series of material contradictions, right? That like there's a disparity of wealth, for instance, or you have a cow and I have a pig and you want bacon and I want milk or something, right? Now there's a contradiction, and so we need to like work it out together, and maybe we bash each other over the head, or maybe we work out a trade or whatever. So to resolve the material contradictions is to resolve the problematic events that arise from these material contradictions. And in a Hegelian way, Marx ends up arguing that there is a teleological or political end to history. And that is with the communist regime, that everybody ends up equal. Because what we want to do, that the whole point of political power in an idealistic sense, which, if Marx is anything, it's an idealist, is to unify people, is to make people work well together, is to like have a political world that is manageable and everybody lives happy lives that are happy together. And so the end of history is the end of contradictions, social contradictions, which means if the contradictions arise from political and material contradictions, then what needs to happen is that we smooth all those out. We give everybody the minimum amount of material wealth or goods or whatever that they need in order to maximize the amount of social coherence and harmony. And so dialectical materialism says that through a historical series of these material contradictions, at the end of that series, there will be an evening out of everything where everybody isn't in contradiction anymore. We're all, happy and healthy and wealthy and looking out for each other. Okay, and this is why dialectical materialism is not why it is in opposition to the existentialist premises, because it is a kind of end that exists before or for the sake that the present exists for the sake of, right? It is saying that human interaction is all for the sake of this goal, this end product, this end of history. But that would be a kind of essence preceding existence. And that's problematic for the existentialists because that causes all sorts of inauthenticity, bad faith, etc. It undermines the power and project of freely willing. So it seems to me, given this objection, that true to form, de Beauvoir was not a communist or a Marxist, even though she, is involved with communism and Marxism, but rather an existentialist all the way through, and one who believed in her own peculiar form of liberalism, which ended up being just very closely aligned to Marxism and French communism, and so it just worked out. So here's where I want to take a pause, right? And hear what your thoughts are. So seeing both the incredible parallels between the Marxist and existentialist projects, and also knowing, on the other hand, the fact that she protested for and with these thinkers and activists, yet is taking shots at them on really fundamental points. How to make sense of this and what we think? I mean, is she, should we call her Marxist? Should we call her something else? Is she giving us a Marx-inspired form of existentialism, or maybe the other way around? Or I don't know, where are your heads at when it comes to her political side? Do we have thoughts?
I think the contradiction between her political activism or whatever and her philosophical ethics is an important part of the dialectical materialism. You need to have these contradictions that need to work themselves out, and they will create new things. And I think Simone de Beauvoir is a perfect example of someone who's taking two separate ideas, working them out, and producing a new set of ideas that we can then take and continue running with. So I do think she was a Marxist in that sense, and I don't know if I would call her necessarily a liberal, although there is an individuality to a lot of her work that I think could be classified as a liberal. But if you actually look at her politics, collectivist action seems to be above all else to Beauvoir in terms of reaching a state of freedom. I from what I've read, I'm not very well read on her, but from what I've read of it, is she does believe that cooperative action is one of the solutions to overcoming these material conditions that have created where we're at today. So I do think she's a Marxist. I don't think Marxism can be pigeonholed as much as a communist party or something of the like, because there's a lot of Marxists that fall outside of that realm.
Sure. Yeah, and like adding in French communism stuff. I mean, these are like the ideas that I'm so really cool thought, Jack. Thank you. So I suppose I should explain the dialectical method as Hegel envisioned it in like a super nutshell. So the idea is that progress is made through synthesis between thesis and antithesis. And I think that was kind of a poem. We'll have to like play it back on the recording and see. So the idea is that you have two ideas in contrast with one another that are antinomies, right? And then you weigh them against one another. And in the weight against one another, you find a synthesis of the ideas that is your progression forward. And we see the dialectical method used not just in Hegel, but in like all sorts of philosophy of the day. So Kant is engaged in dialectical methodology for all of his objections to Hegel. Kierkegaard as well often argues in dialectics. And this is so what Marx is doing is appropriating that philosophical mode of argument for a political philosophically political like narrative or storytelling, which is to say, similarly, in the antithesis of my cow having and the thesis of your pig having, we find a synthesis in the working out of a trade deal or whatever it is, right? And so I think that's a really cool perspective to see the ethics of ambiguity. What de Beauvoir is doing here is itself is a kind of like dialectic, right? Where she's taking the Marxist principles and the existentialist principles and saying that they're opposed, and then working out some sort of synthesis that gets the best of both worlds. Now, it's going to end up being that the communists and Marxists of all sorts don't like this, and they reject the existentialist project of or the existentialist synthesis, and they go their own way. And largely, I think that plays a big part in Sartre's falling out of popular favor and the decline of existentialism as a school of thought, because now it's just historical. So I think that is like the political synthesis side of things sort of breaks a whole lot of the developments intellectually and academically that is like the ripples that had been caused by these guys. So cool idea. Let's do Dallas as a comment and then Grace, and then we'll get to your hand, Sarah. Okay, so Dallas says there's a strain of Marxism that does not believe in dialectical materialism. Althusser, who advocated for this type of Marxism. So de Beauvoir could be a Marxist of that strain. So again, this is kind of why I asked this question, because I'm not an expert at all in political philosophy. It's not my jam. But
And that strain of Marxism is called analytical Marxism, by the way, Althusser's.
Analytical Marxism. Yeah. So maybe there are ties to be made there. If this is interesting, then maybe looking at the relationship between Althusser and analytical Marxism with de Beauvoir would be a cool project. Okay, so Grace says, I think the collectivism contradicts her own theories as an existentialist too much to give her the actual label of Marxist. I think she had some smaller, less ideological parts of the Marxist and communist ideas in France that she agreed with enough to align herself with them politically. Yeah, so this is also something that came up with Jack's comment that I was thinking, that the collectivist action was a huge part of the like praxis of de Beauvoir and Sartre as well, and yet underpinning it all, like the concept that inspires all the way through is this like self-disclosed through interaction with others, but still self-disclosed to oneself, and this need to like be completely free. And the radical responsibility is a radical responsibility to like you, it's universal and to everybody else, but it's sourced in you. And so that there's a really strong strain of individualism to be blended somehow with the like praxis and collective action, which again that's moving out of my depth. I don't really know how to think about that, but I do at least intuitively recognize it as like an interesting problem. And maybe this is why like political philosophy is my jam. I just don't have like natural intuitions about this sort of stuff. So I appreciate your guys' comments. Sarah, you had a hand.
Oh, I just wanted to mention that there are two interesting interviews with her on YouTube. And one of them was an interview from a French interviewer when she was quite young and was being interviewed about the second sex after she'd written it, where she was confronted about, are you uncomfortable that you might be engaging in propaganda, political propaganda, and because of your affiliations, and her activism. And she really took offense to that and said, well, what is propaganda? And she said, well, if it's an idea that I ascribe to and I'm open about ascribing to it, why wouldn't I engage in promoting it? You know, how do you define propaganda? And then in the later interview, when she was more of an elderly woman, she said, I was duped by the communists. And I thought that was interesting because, well, like Jack pointed out, I think that the Marxist idealism or the philosophical Marxism is really different than maybe how the political side went as it was adopted by communists and other things. And I just like this idea you brought out that, like, well, it was highly individualistic, her collective action stuff, that she was the judge of what she ascribed to and promoted, but it wasn't isolationist. It was really based on engaging and committing, but committing without being committing to causes and activity in it, but not with like withholding the philosophical or the withholding her judgment to always answer to herself. I think that was the sense I got of it. It was quite interesting. You guys might enjoy seeing her interviews. If you look up Simone de Beauvoir interviews on YouTube, it's quite interesting.
Yeah, cool. Thanks for sharing that. If you still have the YouTube links like easily available, I would appreciate it. I'm sure your classmates would too. If you put them on the discussion board, that'd be awesome.
Okay, I'll try
definitely watch those. It'd be great. Atticus, do you have a hand too?
Yeah, I just was going to say, I actually first was introduced to Beauvoir through her second sex. Professor Stark, I took a class from her and she really likes her. And that like, maybe I would say she isn't committed to like some of the mechanical aspects of like heavily theoretical Marxism, but it does seem at least, and I don't know necessarily how to think of her in relationship of Marxism and like the piece we read for this class, but the second sex, she seems to like really lean into some of the like identity-based parts of Marxism, especially when she's talking about like womanhood and like what it means to be like this othered class, and like some of the class conversation generally that she talks about. But
Cool. Yeah, my exposure to the second sex is pretty thin. So I'm not familiar with those passages either. So another like cool bit of context there. Thanks, Atticus. Okay, so Quentin had his hand up.
Yeah, so I just actually wanted to go off what both Sarah and Atticus both mentioned, which was commitment. And it seems like at least with de Beauvoir, with her existentialism, there has to be a certain type of commitment. And you have to be able to freely choose, and you can commit to what you choose, but there can never be absolute commitment. You can't say, I'm a Marxist and I'm always a Marxist and I'm dogmatically that way. You can freely choose to be a Marxist, and she could have at that time, but she must have had the freedom to also commit to something else if she wanted to. Otherwise, she couldn't have her existentialism.
Cool. So I like that point too, and that's a little bit more in my ballpark. So I mean, my thought here is that sure, as long as freedom is enabled, it doesn't matter like how it gets used, as long as the project is ethical in ambiguity, then great. But one wouldn't be a Marxist for the sake of Marxism. One would be a Marxist for the sake of the radical expression of one's freedom, right? And that is where you get an overlap and then maybe a disjunction later on as the party line changes. And another sort of just side note, this is like buzzing in the back of my head, is Camus, right? So think of Camus' history, who initially as a young man gets engaged with the Communist Party and then gets in all sort of trouble because they want him to think certain things and act in certain ways and say certain things in his newspapers and his articles. He's like, no, screw you. I'm with the project, but I'm not with the project for the project itself. I'm for it because of my principles and what I think. And so Camus is almost like too much of a rebel to even deal with the party line enough to like be at all engaged with them. Though he does share a lot of the common values and intuitions. Now, Sartre de Beauvoir, less rebellious and find ways to be more consistent with. But again, at least so far as we've read, Camus' absurdist existentialism is solipsistic and individual and rebellious, and so doesn't play or drive as well with political institutions, whereas Sartre and de Beauvoir are trying to take the same intuitions and make them compatible with this politically lived life, to try and take the existentialist project and make like a realpolitik maybe even out of it. Okay, any final thoughts before we move on this point? Cool. Okay, well, we will move on from this point. So from Marxism, we get a development towards freedom. As for us, the existentialists, whatever the case may be, we believe in freedom. Is it true that this belief must lead us to despair? Must we grant this curious paradox? That from the moment a man recognizes himself as free, he is prohibited from wishing for anything. On the contrary, it appears to us that by turning towards this freedom, we are going to discover a principle of action whose range will be universal. The characteristic feature of all ethics is to consider human life as a game that can be won or lost and to teach man the means of winning. I think that is like an incredibly brave thing to say, to relegate the realm of ethics to that of being a game. It kind of makes ethics trivial, but its triviality is here reflected with the nothingness at bottom that is being human. And so what more could it be than a game? And so it is a brave thing to say your ethics isn't all powerful and telling you what to do and absolute and categorical and full of righteousness and sanctimoniousness. No, it's a game and we're here to win the game, but the win conditions are essential. So what are the win conditions? How do you win the game? How do you win the right way? What is the principle under which we can win them? Well, working through ambiguity is the win condition. If you've worked through it, then you're doing, or working through it, I suppose it's an active thing. If you are working through it, then you're doing good. And the way to work through it is through freedom. That's how you win. Freedom is the source from which all significations and all values spring. It is the original condition from which all, wow, did I just repeat that quote twice? Yeah, all right. It is very important. Make a note. I did. So to understand why freedom is this important, to having said that twice, we need to look back to the ambiguity of conscious being. How does consciousness give rise? How does ambiguity spring forth from it? And in what ways does the springing forth of ambiguity through conscious experience overlap with the resolution of freedom? And for Sartre, the freedom is just natural, right? We're all condemned to be free. It's a natural kind of ontological state. For de Beauvoir, in order to get the right kind of ethics that we want, we're going to need to move from this natural freedom that could afford itself to any kind of precociousness or whatever you want to do with it, to an ethical freedom, one that is principled, one that leads us and guides us to winning the game, not just to playing it, right? Natural freedom would allow us to play the game, but we got to win. And this requires an ethical sort of freedom. So ambiguity arises from two kinds of conscious representation, experience, intentionality, whatever. And it's through these that we get the distinction in forms of freedom from de Beauvoir. So remember this slide, right? Now we get some new text on the left. Consciousness is insistent. It's spontaneous. It demands action, and it makes its own intentional representational constructions without our willing. It's just like we see things, we smell things, we hear things, we think things. Thoughts, sensations, representations happen to us spontaneously, sometimes with our will, sometimes without. At least in the case of the insistence of consciousness, it insists on making itself represent without our participation. Be perceived by default. But it's also ambiguous. The conscious representations are incomplete. From a perspective, they preclude self-unification. The body and the mind are co-perceived but never unified, right? That the object and its essence are co-instantiated, but to unify them together is never a complete project. It doesn't absolutely connect. There's no super glue that holds together the world of the mind and the world of that stuff, right? So consciousness attempts to disclose the meaning of being, which is its insistence. It just says X, right? I see redness, whatever. I see a Red Bull bottle. Consciousness can also be made to bring meaning into the world, right? Which is its ambiguity. It's attempting to its attempt to disclose to itself the meaning of its default perception as of X or whatever else. So it says X is ... fill in the blank, or X is like Y, etc. It's trying to explicate its default conceptions, the representations that spontaneously occur to us, to itself. So the world is disclosed to consciousness, and then consciousness discloses the world to itself in trying to dig out, delve into the meaning of these conscious representations. And these give rise to the two fundamental forms of freedom. Consciousness, in its spontaneity, is free to derive its own meaning. It's natural freedom. We're all condemned to be free. We're all condemned to be conscious. We're all condemned to represent, that the world represents itself. And there is a sort of bare given meaning and I would say it's not a given meaning in the way that your very early analytic philosophers would privilege the given, right? That the given is what bare experience, naive realism is what gives us scientific truth and reality. No. It's a thin kind of givenness, but it is still a sort of natural freedom that, it's like spontaneity is free to do it at will. But then there's also the project of our disclosing meaning to ourselves, our imaginative power of projecting onto the world the way that it is to us. So we project meaning limitlessly through our conscious experience, through our imagination, through the understanding, etc. And this is the source of ethical freedom. Ethical freedom is to be distinguished from natural freedom because it is something that we're doing. It's an active process. And there are better and worse ways to construct meaningful representations of the world around us. As she says, human transcendence is vainly engulfed in the miscarried attempts of consciousness to unify itself with being. What a sentence. Absolutely love it. But man also wills himself to be a disclosure of being. And if he coincides with this wish, he wins. For the fact is that the world becomes present by his presence in it, right? That by disclosing the world and doing it in a way that works, we win, right? By engaging in our ethical freedom to meaning make in the world in a way that makes the world what we mean it to be, and not in a way that causes more like dialectical contradictions and stuff. This is what it is to win. This is what it is to work through ambiguity. But this disclosure implies a perceptual tension or perpetual tension to keep being at a certain distance, to tear oneself from the world and to assert oneself as a freedom, that you are imposing this form of meaning making on the world. And you are not the form of meaning making, nor are you the world. You are this thing that imposes. There's a perpetual tension between the in itself and the for itself, trying to unify. To wish for the disclosure of the world and to assert oneself as freedom are one and the same movement. Therefore, the man who seeks to justify his life must want freedom itself absolutely and above everything else. And here we go. This is like the beginning of the foundation of the ethics. This is like the principle. We don't have the ethics yet. We don't have like what it looks like or how it's supposed to work, but we have how it's supposed to work, which is through the modus operandi of ethical freedom, of the willing of this limitlessness of the imaginative experience to disclose the meaning in being to ourselves and to one another in a way that doesn't cause the dialectical contradictions, that works, right? And so like Sartre, de Beauvoir recommends here at the end that we will freedom for its own sake, and that doesn't make sense. For our own sake, but we will it for the sake of itself. And that is because to will freedom for the sake of itself is reflectively, recursively at least, to project a world that enables us to freely will as much and as deeply as we are able, but also like together to have everybody willing freedom is to have a maximally free world, and that's the only way through ambiguity, so they argue. Sarah asks, so she believes in seeking the transcendence of the unification of the individual perspective, values, or projection of meaning, and one's actions that engage the world and others in those values. Transcendence of the unification of the individual. I'm not sure what that means.
Well, I'm just wondering this part about transcendence. There was so much with Camus and others about not seeking transcendence and not hoping for transcendence. On the last page of it says human transcendence is vainly engulfed in the miscarried attempts of consciousness to unify itself with being. So does she believe in transcendence? Does she believe in transcendence through another means than trying to unify yourself with your own being? Or does she think you can unify yourself with your own being? Or does she think you get some kind of transcendence by projecting your values out on the world and being active, engaging with others to promote those values?
Yeah.
This transcendence, I don't know about this transcendence. Can you place it for me?
Me either. It's a complicated word that is unclear in how it's being used. My best guess is that human transcendence here is, as you say, the project of unifying the for itself and the in itself natures in our like being. We try to disclose the meaning of our own being to ourselves, and yet we always fail. They're all miscarried attempts.
But is she promoting that? Sorry, because it's miscarried because it's with just isolated, and she's saying, well, no, get out there and engage with others, and then you might achieve some kind of transcendence of unifying the real world with your individual values.
Yeah, so I think there isn't like an end of transcendence. There's not like there's not like a nirvana state that we reach by, meditating deeply enough, right? By engaging in the practice, we get to the end. It's just that you're winning when you use the failure as an inspiration to make the failure a little bit less awful and harsh and complete. And so there's no transcendence on the other end of things. At the end of the day, the ambiguity is too thick, but at least we can use our failure not to fall into despair, but to make stuff that works a little bit better and a little bit clearer than the despair-inspiring practices that we might engage in by default.
Okay, I've just got to ask this follow-up question. Is the ambiguity, is that the ambiguity, the contradiction between our in itself and for itself, or is the ambiguity the fact that there are all these different perspectives in all these different for itselfs, and that we're trying to project our values onto the world, and yet everyone has their own for itself perspective that isn't possible to unify.
It's the first one.
Okay.
Yeah. It's
Okay,
a,
so between your in itself and for itself, and it doesn't really have to do with all the different perspectives out there.
no, it just has to do with the condition of being human, uncharacterized by any extra stuff. That there is a space in between what we are and what we hope to be, and this foils all of our hopes and dreams. It makes the world muddled and confused. It makes our ability to work through it muddled and confused. However we choose to do so, it doesn't really matter. But that being the basis for what it is to be human at all is the ambiguity at sort of the ground floor of all other perspectives and processes.
So it's ambiguous what how we can connect with our ideal self, our for itself. It's ambiguous. I'm just struggling with the idea of ambiguity. What is ambiguous?
There's a confusion, a thickness, a static, as Heidegger calls it, again, like the void of the nothingness in itself that separates these two. Anxiety for Kierkegaard, right? The absurd for Camus. I mean, they're all it's all metaphorical language meant to express that incapacity of the human understanding, or human being, depending on who it is that's arguing, to make the world, or to be in the world in a way that is satisfying, period. And for de Beauvoir, we get ambiguity rather than absurdity or anxiety or nothingness in itself. Because what she wants to do is to say that even if it is at bottom ambiguous, that is like the human condition is ambiguous, then at least it can be clarified somewhat. We can work our way through it. And this inspires, again, the ethics. Okay. Where other views won't inspire ethics, they'll inspire ethics of like quantity, right? She wants to give us some sort of qualitative way of living well, win conditions for doing well in spite of this at bottom confusion and incapacity to capture the world with our understanding completely, universally, wholly. So the move to ethical freedom. Natural freedom, Sartre's kind, we're condemned to be free, is not enough to guarantee an ethics. And ethics are necessary not only to living well together, but in living well at all. Insofar as we exist in a social world for whom the for oneself is being disclosed by being together. We are capable of limiting one another's ability to be free, of placing constraints on one another, willfully or accidentally. The Good Place is a nice example of this. Spoiler alert, turn off your volume if you really want to watch it. It's like years old, so I don't feel bad about spoiling it, but here's like a whole 30-second preamble, give you time to mute if you want to. The premise is that the characters aren't actually in heaven where they're like, supposed to be, but they're in hell. And it turns out even further that everybody goes to hell these days, because we all live in a world that makes it impossible to get a good score and like do well, because insofar as you exist, you perpetuate Nestle, creating more plastic bottles and depleting the oceans of water and acidifying the oceans, and like all that stuff. You sin by existing, period. This is what it is to like, you can't buy a dozen roses anymore. You can't do anything anymore without harming somebody somewhere. So just even in our being in the world that we're in today, we constrain one another's freedom. That, you know, like if you want to wear a t-shirt, but you're impoverished in America, you go to Walmart and you buy the $3 t-shirt. But what have you done is you've just, you know, like helped pay the company that makes little Filipino kids work in a sweatshop until they die of whatever they die of in sweatshops at age 8, very cutely and sadly, I imagine, right? You know, poor little sweatshop kids. So we're capable of limiting one another's freedom accidentally in that sort of case, but also willfully. Say I put handcuffs on you, then what are you going to do about it? You got to like ask me for the key back. So we can also like impose ourselves on each other. And if freedom is the source of the win condition, which she hasn't explained why yet. But if the sort of ethical freedom is like the win condition for an ethics that allows us to live well together, to clarify ambiguity, et cetera, then we ought not to be limiting one another's freedom in systems that perpetuate accidental or actually like explicit limitations, constraints on each other's freedoms. Yeah, drink oat milk rather than almond milk. It tastes better and it's better morally, I think. The hedge, I think, is important for all these sorts of claims. And I use it seriously. In de Beauvoir's sense of seriously too. So the free imagination of possibility projected meaning through the infinite density of existence, it's like the ambiguity again, is what enables us to work through the ambiguity of being. And we cannot unify our of itself for itself natures ever, but we can contrive to do so by projecting a meaning that makes the leap, that we sort of work our way towards it. And if we're not trying to get like a transcendence, right, to reach an end of history, at least what we can do is recognize that if there is any way through this incredibly dense nature of the problem of being, then it's not a project, an end goal, but rather a methodology. It's a how-to, and that how-to is through the expression of freedom. The only genuine leap or meaning making that can be authentic to the unchangeable reality of being's ambiguity is to will freedom for itself. We aim ourselves at a methodology rather than a specific point. We make our meaning making activities about the transcendence of meaning making generally, rather than about the meaning that we make it about how we meaning make. So for Nietzsche, his whole life goal was the transvaluation of all values, right? Reinterpret what it means to like be valued at all through his eternal return, which isn't creating a value so much as creating a methodology for reinterpreting values. Similar here in Beauvoir, we're not seeing be virtuous or do God's will or don't hurt other people or do what's best for the most amount of people, or what you're seeing be free. You're given a methodology rather than a product of methodology. And this is possible because our being is what she calls a kind of negativity. It's a failure, right? It's this empty space. Our being is ambiguity. It's an negative without that has the power, this freedom, to aim at positive ends. That from that empty space within, that middle void, the ambiguous place in the middle for itself and the in itself, there is the conscious power to imagine and create and move forward. And that freedom is what we're supposed to weaponize, is probably too aggressive a word, but weaponize less aggressively for the sake of living well together. Atticus says it seems like a complicated way to say fake it till you never, in parens, make it. Yeah. But it has more substance than that, right? It's not just fake, like fake what? Like there is a principle to it. It's just the principle is sort of abstract, hollow, maybe is a good word. It's without body, because the universal human condition is without body. But what there is freedom in the meantime. One cannot deny being. Being itself and the negation has no hold over this being, this pure positivity. One does not escape this fullness. A destroyed house is a ruin. A broken chain is a scrap, iron. One attains only signification, and through it, the for itself which is projected there. The for itself carries nothingness in its heart and can be annihilated, whether in the very upsurge of its existence or through the world in which it exists, which World War II, right? You know, a bunch of young men going off to die 10 years after their dads did. Therefore, itself being annihilated in the upsurge of their existence or afterwards, in the destroyed world in which they find themselves, and no more farms but foxholes all around. The prison is repudiated as such when the prisoner escapes, but revolt, insofar as it is a pure negative movement, remains abstract. It is fulfilled this freedom only by returning to the positive, that is, by giving itself a content through action, escape, political struggle, revolution. Human transcendence then seeks, with the destruction of the given situation, the whole future which will flow from its victory. Thus, just as life identified with the will to live, freedom always appears as a movement of liberation. So, question. Let's pause for a moment and reflect on this. I've said a lot that is not entirely clear, and I recognize that because we're working with very unclear, challenging concepts. And what she says here is also not entirely clear. I've done my best so far to give character to it, so hopefully, like, it doesn't come off as babble. Because it's not babble. This is a really important piece to understand. This is the sort of the turning point, the linchpin, the keystone of the ethics of ambiguity that we see failures of in the final portion of the lecture and of our reading today, and what we'll see the final development of in actual practice for next week's reading. So, pausing for a moment, what do we think that this means so far? What is the moving force of the ethics of ambiguity, this like negative project, this negation that finds positive outcome through the expression of ethical freedom, right? What are our thoughts so far?
Well, I just will say, I think that she has a lot of confidence in her fellow humans, that she's trusting everyone's plunge into willing ethical freedom for everyone else, and just thinking that that's all good. It's kind of a quantity thing in a way, because it seems like she's just, there's no hierarchy, just everybody is jumping in there and going by their own freedom and their own individual self projecting into the world. And she's saying, well, somehow ethics will emerge from this willing of freedom. I don't know, it's quite interesting.
Yeah. So there is a hierarchy, which is like the next chunk of lecture and of the reading is like all the people that fail to will freedom in the right sort of way. So she's like going to get specific about how this expression is supposed to work, and then become way more specific in the next half of the book. But yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right in principle that this is a kind of idealism. It's a sort of faith that, even if you carve out the bad ways, that the one good way will still produce the kind of end and clarity that you're hoping for. Yeah, and it seems like Atticus is having similar practical concerns. So she mentions Nietzsche being a Nazi, but not being a Nazi way. So like Nietzsche isn't a Nazi at all, but his ideas get appropriated by Nazis. Nietzsche would have absolutely hated the Nazis had he been alive. But his, bare will to power interpreted inappropriately is a huge tool along with like the Reich power Germanic nationalism that comes from Wagner, Nietzsche's mentor and close friend. But yeah, you might see a similar sort of taking advantage, or if not taking advantage, at least ugliness on the other end. But I would say, like, so if I'm de Beauvoir responding to this sort of objection, I say, well, yeah, maybe, but in a political movement where the alternative is fascism and the Nazi regime that we've seen sweep the world and destroy Europe, we got to have some alternative, and this is the best one. Everything else is inappropriate, full of bad faith, disingenuous, etc. We'll do Atticus as a follow-up, and then Quentin, I think you had your hand.
Yeah.
Okay. Atticus?
Yeah, it just, I feel like this whole argument makes me itchy, and like maybe it'll make me less itchy when she explains more. But I feel like it's a lot of like, as long as you're playing the game in a way that you feel free, or you feel like you're, then like gold star, you're doing the thing, which is like then like the Nazi thing of like, okay, well, I think that I'm doing this in a way that is working through ambiguity, but it's also like maybe objectively bad. But I guess if she doesn't believe in a like the good or the whatever, then it doesn't matter. It also just strikes me as similar to like some of the complaints of like cultural relativism, of like everybody's things are equally great and whatever, and we have no like way to evaluate whether somebody else's like movements or freedom are like good or bad in any way, as long as they're doing the freedom movements. It just seems to like run into contradiction, especially with like her heavily activist life, imposing these ideals and thoughts about how things should be in a society if we live in a society.
We do live in a society, for better and worse. Especially today. We live in a society. Yeah, you might think that in objecting to Camus' incredible individualism, which requires like a sanctity of the form of action that you're performing. It requires a sort of genuineness, the ability to like justify in oneself, that you might, in universalizing the existentialist premises to a like political hemisphere of thought and action, practice and process, you might sort of wash out too much of the individual accountability, and end up with something that may not give you what you hope to find. That's an interesting thought. And I think that the hope would be that that wouldn't happen, because you still have that touch of individual power, that need of the self to be the first step towards the collective freedom, that one's own freedom is disclosed by others, but of course it is first inspired in itself, for itself, and then it's through the inspiration to unify with the for itself that we see the need for freedom to be universalized, and that might be enough, but who knows in practice? I mean, it's an interesting thought that there could be some slippery space, shot through the gap that de Beauvoir leaves open. Quinn.
Yeah, so I was just going to say that to me, this looks like a starting point, and the starting point that she's pointing toward is just the philosophy of action, that to have any ethical ends, we have to project our freedom into the actual world. We can't, just let it, what does she call it? She calls it flight. You can't just let the freedom that comes to you intrinsically just be cerebral all the time. Without action, there can't be any ethical movement at all.
Cool. Yeah. So that's a good point, and one that de Beauvoir agreed with. Of the Ethics of Ambiguity, post having written The Second Sex later in her career, says that her one regret with this book was that it was not specific enough, right? It did not clarify enough. And so you're absolutely right that at this point, we're getting like a framework for the ethics of ambiguity, but we're not given the content that allows us to judge one way or another if we should really be happy with it, or if it's going to leave that one little spot on the back of our back, unitched, and it's just going to be there perpetually. She felt that way too, but in The Second Sex thinks that she does give more development to these concepts, and some more body and warm blood. Grace says, but that would be assuming that other people are not actively infringing on each other's rights. Oh, in response to Sarah's, if freedom is willed at all, though, there could be no impression. Yeah, so you wouldn't have a fascism in this view at all. What you might get is something like what Atticus was saying, which is, it looks like a too slippery of a sort of relativism. Scott. Can't hear you, Scott. You still have a hand up?
Sorry. Yep. I was muted. I pressed a different button. So one thing I wanted to mention about Nazism and the ethics of ambiguity is that this is kind of classic in the literature and psychology in terms of cognitive dissonance, that the people who are on the ground, like the actual Nazis who were in Auschwitz, suffered, quote unquote, a huge amount of dissonance during their action, where they specifically distanced themselves from their freedom, said, oh, the bosses say this, just following orders, coming up with justifications that didn't actually match their experiences. And so I think that you can make a pretty clear case that those sorts of actions wouldn't be possible from someone who was appropriately engaging with ambiguity. So I don't think that the freedom here is scary. It's kind of terrifying in some ways to just say, hey, everyone figure it out on your own. But it also gives room to say, hey, you aren't figuring this out right. Here is this scientifically real thing of cognitive dissonance that is clearly being active here and needs to be worked through.
Yeah, that's a cool thought. So let's see if I'm understanding it correctly, that there's like a psychological protection against some of the worries that we brought up here in the last 5-10 minutes or so, which is to say that say you are a young Nazi recruit and you get sent to Death Camp X. In order to perform the work required by your boss at Death Camp X, you need to completely disassociate from the work of Death Camp X, which is to not be free, to not will your own freedom, not will freedom for its own sake. And if the system of political governance or whatever was one that produced Death Camp X, then it's producing a system that, constrains freedom. And so if we had a system that were maximally open to freedom, we wouldn't see the psychological symptoms of the disabuse of oneself from one's freedom, which really typically occurs in pretty heinous situations. So we can see this psychological event, this disassociation, as a symptom of things not going well. And if people aren't having those sorts of psychological problems, then Hakuna Matata, all's well, dude.
That's what she addresses as the subman or the serious man, isn't it? That exact instance of the
Yeah.
Nazi who's being told what to do
That's exactly
and
right.
isn't exercising their freedom. So,
Yeah. So we'll talk about the subman in just a moment. But the subman is the one who says, "Oh yeah, I'm free," but then isn't genuinely free, right? And so they become liable to anything. They are the ones for whom everything is permissible in the vulgar sense because they are free, but there are no constraints on that freedom because it's unprincipled freedom. Principled freedom wills freedom for its own sake. Unprincipled freedom wills anything, and more often than not, the pretty ugly things. Sarah says, I like Scott's parallel between inauthenticity and cognitive dissonance, that one would not be authentically acting freely if one has the dissonance of groupthink or mob or mass political actions, whereas participants dissociate from their individual moral self voice. Yeah, I think you're right. It is an interesting example, and it almost harkens back to the original discussion about the difference between respecting one's own freedom and the collective voice that comes with, often with at least a Marxist project. So all of these problems are sort of swirling in the same space, which I think means that we're onto something. We're onto the right sort of thinking, which is good. So let's carve out this conceptual space a little bit more. In the final push of the lecture, we'll see some ways in which the willing of freedom can fail. Okay, so mistakes and examples in freedom. One mistake is the child. Another is the serious man. Another is the subman. There is the adventurer and the passionate. There's also the nihilist, which I didn't include in the lecture. We've talked a lot about nihilism. You get the idea there. But the idea is that all of these characters, at least, share the quality of inappropriately managing their freedom, not doing it authentically, so that it either operates that as their freedom, not at all, for the nihilist and for the child and the serious man, or in vain for the subman and for the adventurer, or unethically, right, for the subman specifically. So she says of the child, and this is a picture of her as a child and from her memoir. The child's situation is characterized by his finding himself cast into a universe which he has not helped to establish, which has been fashioned without him, and which appears to him as an absolute to which he can only submit. When the joy of existing is strongest, when the child abandons himself to it, he feels himself protected against the risk of existence by the ceiling which human generations have built over his head. And it is by virtue of this that the child's condition is metaphysically privileged. Normally, the child escapes the anguish of freedom. He can, if he likes, be recalcitrant, lazy. His whims and his faults concern only him. They do not weigh upon the earth. They cannot make a dent in the serene order of a world which existed before him without him, where he is in a state of security by virtue of his very insignificance. He can do with impunity as he likes. He knows that nothing can ever happen through him. Everything is already given. His acts engage nothing, not even himself. So existence for the child is gratuitous, like by definition. It has no purpose. And we see it in a full and complete expression of natural freedom, that the child is condemned to be free, and so they'll just do whatever they will on a whim. But they have no mind towards the responsible use of that freedom. It's just for the sake of the whim, right? The child has no mind for the effect of their freedom in the world. Every action is a free whim, and just wants to satisfy itself. And this is because the world already exists for the child. They don't have a place in it. And it's crystallized in its form. They don't have the power to make their own place in it. The world appears to be an essence that precedes the child's existence, and so they treat it as such. So the child takes it very seriously. Like, I got to listen to my parents. They know way better than I do. And it comes naturally, listening to your parents. And nobody, or very rarely, is anybody born a rebel, right? You listen, yes or no, sir. At least where I come from, it's yes or no, sir, right? The child cannot fathom the ambiguity of being yet, right? They haven't hit adolescence, nor their freedom. And so they are innocent of any harm or crime. And we treat them this way. That's why we call them innocent, because they haven't yet faced the ambiguity, the absurd, that distance, that empty space, the void of nothingness that inspires anxiety. And nor should they be forced to face it. It will come naturally enough. And when they lose their innocence, it's sad, but it's inevitable. Better not to force the inevitability than to do so. But still, the child is incomplete and imperfectly represents the use of freedom to be in the world. They are condemned to be free, but they don't use it ethically, right? So we get the child. And then we get the subman. Where did I put the serious man? Did I completely? I think I deleted my slide on the serious man. Okay. Well, that's unfortunate. We'll stop here and I'll talk about the serious man. And I think the serious man must be in the slides I uploaded to Canvas because I do the breaking apart after. So my apologies. But the serious man is the sort of person who never grows up, who continues to treat life as if it is crystallized before them. They are the fatalist in the world. They are the fanatics, the ones who believe that everything is determined, it's all written. The Calvinist preacher speaking from the pulpit, right, saying it's all fire and brimstone, and we're all do hell and damnation, and there's nothing we can do about it, right? These are the serious people that that they don't accept the fact that they're free. There is no freedom for this sort of person. And they take the world far too seriously. They don't allow themselves to express an imaginative power. They don't allow themselves to bring meaning to being because all of the meaning is already there and they just have to like follow along as best they can. So that's the serious man. And then there is the subman. This picture great. I did not, when I Google image searched the subman, this is not what I expected to find. I do this frequently, just like for fun, like really jargony philosophical concept, Google image search and see what comes up. And I was so absolutely delighted when this is the picture I found. Oh man, it's just lovely. So the subman. If we were to try to establish a kind of hierarchy among men, we would put those who are denuded of this living warmth on the lowest rung of the ladder, which the living warmth is the sort of like passionate vivacity that you see in people who are expressing themselves in putting, like making their mark in the world. The artist lives artistically, right? The ones who are denuded of this sort of living warmth are lowest on the hierarchy of what it is to be. To exist is to make oneself a lack of being. It is to cast oneself into the world. Those who occupy themselves in restraining this original movement can be considered submen. They have eyes and ears, but from childhood on, they make themselves blind and deaf. Without love and without desire, this apathy manifests a fundamental fear in the face of existence, in the face of the risk and the tensions which it implies. The subman rejects this passion, which is his human condition, the laceration and the failure of that drive toward being, which always misses its goal, but which thereby is the very existence which he rejects. So the idea of the subman is that they recognize that they have freedom, but they do not think through the implications of their being free. They, in fact, take a leap away from it. They commit a kind of philosophical suicide in abnegation from responsibility. And this is a problem. So man is one who accepts that he's free, but only willfully. He accepts no responsibility for his freedom, nor does he consider himself responsible. Freedom is a simple thing for the subman. It's just to be able to do. I can. So why not? It comes with, not other baggage. It doesn't come with other baggage. And what baggage it does come with, that is freedom, the subman turns a blind eye towards. That it's just easy. I don't have to think about you. I don't have to think about the future. I don't have to think about the past. All I got to think about is me and mine. And I can, and so I will, right? American Psycho kind of like Christian Bale sort of character here in the subman, right? The submen are those who in fanatic circles do the dirty work. They are the hitmen, the ones who draw the rope in the lynching, the ones who pull the trigger in the gas chamber, right? And it may be banal, right? You know, my boss told me to do it, but it is done anyways. And why do they do it? Well, because they can, and there's no, for them, principled reason not to. if it is enabled by their power and it enables their power, then the subman will, for better and worse, unprincipally, without responsibility. The submen turn the negativity of the human condition, that is its ambiguity, that nothingness that we make ourselves into, the lack of being from which we can derive an ethics of ambiguity, from which we can derive reasons not to kill ourselves, from which we can derive the social workings together of an existentialist Marxist, whatever it ends up being, project. The submen turns that negativity of the human condition, which is its freedom, into further negativity and denial. Okay. And now we have a head-to-head for the ages. You buy a ticket for the whole seat for this battle, but you're only going to need the edge of it because you're going to be sitting way forward, real excited about what's about to happen. We got Camus and de Beauvoir. De Beauvoir's objection to the adventurer, right? So when she's mentioning the adventurer, she's talking about Camus' character here from the myth of Sisyphus. Camus' character is the absurd hero, the hero of the ethic of quantity. But this person, according to de Beauvoir, is too solipsistic, too abstract. They haven't taken the step that's necessary to take in order to act authentically in good faith. So she says, even if we consider adventure in its purity, for all of its excitement and wonder and power and glory, that which lights up the absurd with lovely color, right? One must imagine the void with its own color, says Camus, right? That's what adventure in its purity does. Still yet, says Beauvoir, it appears to us to be satisfying only at a subjective moment, abstractly, which the fact is abstract. And it's internal. It only has to do with that adventurer's life. It's not universalizable. It's not a principle of ethically living. It's a principle of living in spite of an absurd, solipsistic, completely internal and subjective experience. And the problem is that when we're encountered by the other, we become committed to the other, so says de Beauvoir. And so she takes Camus' heroes and says, look, they're encountered by other people. Don Juan is encountered by a virus. The conquistadors meet the natives. The adventurer is disclosed to himself by those that he interacts with. So Camus' project was an internal and subjective one. Everything is absurd, even the other, right? And we remember his example of the dumb show that the monkey through the glass of the telephone booth, that for Camus, this person expressing whatever is going on in their conversation is opaque. It's a hidden mystery. It just further exemplifies the absurd. But for de Beauvoir and for Sartre, there's a different psychological element. There's another step to be taken, which is that it's not quite a dumb show because you see yourself projected in it. And you see the possibility and you see the similarity, the family resemblance of the one to the other, of the other to you. And this disclosure is an essential feature of the recognition that we are free and the eventual dissolution of ambiguity. But for Camus, it itself is absurd. There is no disclosure of the other. There is only the absurd and one's relationship to it, at least in the myth of Sisyphus. For Camus, again, others disclose nothing more than further absurdity. And so they do not factor into the ethic of quantity as Camus wants it. For de Beauvoir, this is not the case. Encountering others is essential. Hence, the adventurer cares for action only for its own sake and not for the sake of others, not for the sake of freedom, but for the sake of rebellion against the absurd. Okay. It's a kind of failure, so says Beauvoir, in judgment to forget the other, who we must remember ought to be considered in our form of action, because freedom is the universal human condition, and we disclose one another to one another and one's freedom to one another. And so we are responsible not just for our own freedom, but for freedom universally across the board. Now, in contrast to the adventurer who's full of spirit, right, in clarifying the absurd, there is the passionate. This person has passion in spite of the ambiguity and nothingness, the negation of our condition, et cetera, right? The Thelma and Louise, the Butch and Sundance, Romeo and Juliet. Butch and Sundance weren't lovers, but they're good buddies. So in contrast to the adventurer, the passionate person is not indifferent to the world of others. Camus' characters are incredibly indifferent, but there's a cool indifference, and this is what empowers their ability to deal with the absurd. But the passionate isn't indifferent at all. They're very committed to the world. But the passionate person cares more for the satisfaction of their passion than for the principle of the actions that they take to satisfy the passion, right? Thelma and Louise and Butch Cassidy rob banks and end up getting killed, and Romeo and Juliet kill themselves together. And so they're satisfying their passion, but not in a way that universally exemplifies freedom. Right? The passionate person is an existentialist who forgets that one must not only be free, but also that the expression of freedom is both social and universal. They're not only responsible to be free, but to will the freedom for all others as well. And so what de Beauvoir is going to end up saying is that you take the vitality of the adventurer and the passion of this person, and you blend them together, and you get an ethic of ambiguity that remains responsible to freedom. So a path forward. As she says, there is no way for man to escape the ambiguity of his being in the world. It is in this world that he must realize himself morally. Freedom must project itself towards its own reality through a content whose value it establishes. An end is valid only by a return to the freedom which established it and which willed itself through with this end. But this will implies that the freedom is not engulfed by any goal. Neither is it to dissipate itself vainly without aiming at a goal. It is not necessary for the subject to seek to be, but it must desire that there be being. To will oneself free and to will that there be being are one and the same choice. The choice that man makes of himself as a presence in the world. So in order to will for the sake of freedom, you have to have a goal, but it's not the goal that you're really willing. It's like the goal that feeds back into the willing for freedom for its own sake, right? That's what she's saying here. And to will freedom is to will being is to will freedom is to will being. That's the same thing. So being is not only our own being is disclosed by all those around us. And to freely will that there be being is to will the freedom of others being as well. To will oneself free is also to will others free. This will is not an abstract formula. It points out to each person concrete action to be achieved. But the others are separate, even opposed. And the man of goodwill sees concrete and difficult problems arising from his relations with them. That is, the projects that the formula of willing freedom for its own sake might become opposed to one another in the way that mankind works together with this as the methodology of being free can give rise to problems. The question thus becomes, if the goodwill wills universally or wills the universality of freedom through being, how can we will this and also all get along, right? Because what we've gotten is a methodology, an abstraction, a form of an ethics without a principled direction for what this ethics looks like and how it actually operates as an ethic. So stay tuned for part 2. And hold on, don't leave quite yet. I'm gonna stop the recording here.